Thank the library. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all for coming out to listen about Yogacara and karma. I'll apologize from the beginning. For those of you who are more advanced, that the talk will be relatively rudimentary because I was told there'll be many people here who don't have much background. And for those who don't have much background, I'll apologize if things occasionally might get a little steep. Hopefully that's not the case. I'm going to try to avoid as much as possible jargon and technical terminology, maybe a little bit here and there where it's necessary, but I'm going to try to keep it fairly direct and hopefully accessible for everyone. What I won't apologize for, if you were here, most of you I think were here in the last 10 minutes or so, and they folded up the screen and all that. I will not apologize for the fact that there's no PowerPoint. Okay, there will be no PowerPoint. It's become almost customary, expected, that for talks people have PowerPoints, nice pretty pictures, little bullets, words that'll tell you exactly what I'm saying as if my saying it's not enough. And it creates expectations, and we have a habit of it. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's feeding back. Okay, thanks. We have a habit of it. We have an expectation. We repeat it over and over again, and every time we come to a new situation, we expect the same thing to happen again. That's karma. And it's based on conditioning. And we think conditioning is something that at least people used to think this. Conditioning is something we acquired after we were born. We're acculturated. Our parents inflict things on us, our culture inflicts things on us, that supposedly we come out as blank slates, and that all this stuff happens to us. That's actually been disproven for a long time. Very simple but very compelling experiment was done at this point probably 40 years ago in Israel with newborns. They discovered newborns, well, they sort of knew it, but they used it for an experiment. Newborns, even fresh out of the womb, make faces. And the faces tell you whether they're happy or sad, whether they're enjoying something or not. And so newborns who were literally 10 minutes out of the womb, had not yet gotten accustomed to mama's cooking, were given little dabs of various different flavors on Q-tips. And lo and behold, they didn't all show happy faces for the same flavors. They didn't all show sad faces for the different flavors. They actually liked different things. They came out of the womb with preferences. So where did they pick them up? If you're a Buddhist, you'd say in a past life. If you're not a Buddhist, you scratch your head. So do you believe in past lives or not? You test for it. That's an interesting test. We also know about things like reflexes, which kick in at various times. This sounds a little bit un-Buddhist, but it really isn't. At various times, milestones in life, various reflexes kick in. If you're an average American kid, probably somewhere around the 7th grade, you got great delight out of very quickly flashing your hands in front of another kid's face because it makes the kid flinch. When I was a kid, we used to say, made you flinch, made you flinch. So where did the flinching reflex come from? You didn't learn that. Nobody sat you down in flinching school and taught you how to flinch. You had ancestors, which would be the Western explanation, long time ago, who obviously got hit in the face many, many times. So much so that when you're born, you're already flinching still left over from their karma. So their past lives, your past lives, there's no self in Buddhism, supposedly, so why would it have to be you are the person who got hit in the previous life? We're all sort of are inheriting each other's karma in a certain way. Anyway, to believe, to not to believe, to test. From a Buddhist point of view, one tests, one experiments, but one keeps an open mind. From the Yogacara point of view, the fact that there's no PowerPoint, I'll go back to that for a second, is because we're already projecting. Your mind is already projecting. This is already PowerPoint. And it's at least partly your PowerPoint, because the way you hear what I'm saying is different from the way everyone else in the room is hearing what I'm saying. If it makes sense to you, that has something to do with your past. If it doesn't make sense, likewise. If you agree with what I'm saying, likewise. If you disagree, likewise. If what you find about what I'm saying pleasant, also, that's your past, not mine. That's your PowerPoint. That's your karma. So, basic karmic question. Karma, of course, means action. The basic word just means action. Nothing more dramatic than that. And it has something to do with cause and effect. Causes lead to effects. Effects become causes of subsequent effects. So with that simple idea in mind, the karmic question is, what brought you to this place right now? Why are you here? That would include every little thing you've done all day. What you had for breakfast or didn't have for breakfast. What you had for breakfast yesterday. Why you like to come to Buddhist monasteries. And on and on. It would include beyond that, why are there Buddhist monasteries in the first place? It's not all just about you. Your PowerPoint is about you, but it's about more than that. Who built this place? Why are there microphones? Why is there no PowerPoint? All those questions. And trace it back. It's not just what happened today, it's what happened many, many years ago. And if you remember, for those of you a little bit more advanced, this will be very familiar. If you remember the story of Buddha's own enlightenment, that's basically the question he was asking on that final night. How did I get here? And he traced back all the events that led to that moment, which for him, of course, meant not only what he did that day and the day before, and the day before, and the week before, and the year before, but the lifetime before. In that life, I was such and such a person. I did such and such a thing. All those actions led to certain consequences, which lead to me being here. And the life before that. And the life before that. Tracing it back in specificity. Specificity is important. And the second watch of the night, he then thinks about everyone else. How did they get here? Where are they going? Where are they coming from? And he traces back, so-and-so was such and such a person in this life, they did these kinds of deeds, those led to these, those led to these. And so it took him 2 watches of the night to come up with this kind of formula. That actions lead to consequences and people are where they are because of karma. But for him it was important, and it should be for us too, if we want to practice anything, not just to have a formula. The formula is easy, we can all say that. But to actually do the practice in specificity. To trace it out, to do the homework, to do the self-analysis. Only after he did that did he then enter the 3rd watch of the night, which would be a subject really for another talk on pratitya samuppada, dependent origination. And he asked the question, which is what got him in the forest in the first place, why is there death? Which is a way of saying, why is there suffering? Why are things impermanent? Why doesn't anything last? And I don't want to get too depressing, but if you think about it long enough, if everything that you accomplish is going to disappear someday, what's the point? It's pretty depressing. If everything that's beautiful will fade, what's the point? And everything is impermanent. There are some philosophies and some religions that try to encourage you otherwise. They try to invent permanent things to believe in. But Buddhism was very courageous early on and said, no, look around, there's nothing permanent. It's all impermanent. Impermanence leads to suffering because even things which are pleasurable lead to attachment. You enjoy them. What happens when they fade? What happens when someone dies? It's not just your death, It's other people too. The closer and more attached you are, the harder it is. So even joy is suffering. So why is there suffering? He came up with a brilliant answer. Or why is there death, is the way he put it. Why is there death? There's death because there's birth. You don't want to die, don't get born. It's too late. So, he thinks through this process and eventually comes up with, it's all based on ignorance. We don't understand what's going on. As I said, it would be a different lecture to go through all 12 links. That's karma. Once he figures that out, if you eliminate ignorance, eventually you eliminate birth and death. That's enlightenment. Now, just to emphasize or re-emphasize or underline the fact that it's about specifics. What one of the Pali texts in the Vinaya tells us is that after his enlightenment experience, he didn't go out and party and celebrate. He spent the next couple weeks sitting under another tree, going over those same 12 links over and over and over again, in specificity, drawing out their details, unpacking them, thinking about them this way, that way. And that's before he went out and taught and, started being Buddha. That's after enlightenment. So before enlightenment, even more so. It's also a kind of hint about how those of you who are reading about Buddhist literature have to approach a lot of the material. A lot of the material becomes condensed models. They love to have lists. I'm sure most of you noticed that. They love lists. And the point of Buddhism is not to memorize as many lists as you can memorize before you die. That's not going to help. It's good for the memory, but that's not going to help. The idea is, how do you unpack the list? There's something going on there. How do you add the water to the ramen so you can actually eat the instant ramen? Karma gets compact, and we have to open it up. And how do you open it up? You open it up with experience. You open it up with analysis. You open it up with reflection, with paying attention. There are actually a lot of words in Sanskrit and in Pali for paying attention. We translate them in all sorts of different ways, but they basically just mean pay attention. Don't get distracted. Before he sat down under the Bodhi tree, he made a vow to himself, is one of the ways they put it, but he made this determination, I'm not going to move from this spot. No distractions. We're all distracted. They put things in our ears, they play music. We're doing this all day. TV, radio, stereo, whatever. Distraction, distraction, distraction. And if you take away people's distractions for 5 minutes, they start to get antsy and nervous. So eliminate distractions, pay attention. Why? Because what you do becomes habitual, becomes karmic. I heard that some of you heard a lecture already today on karma, so some of this might sound a little bit familiar. But karma is intentional action. And for the Buddhists, it differentiates them from some of the other Indian schools. For the Buddhists, intention is the important ingredient. And it's intentional action of body, speech, and mind. What you do with your body, your gestures. Speech includes not just what you say out loud, but pretty much anything to do with language. And mind is all sorts of thoughts. You have intentions, motives, motivations. That's what makes it karmic. That's what gives you responsibility for the action. Some Buddhists contrast that with kriya. Kriya is just bare action. And there's no karmic consequence. If something happens in your vicinity completely unintentionally, you're not responsible for that, even if there are dire consequences. If you have an intention, even if you don't carry it out, then you have responsibility for that. Some Buddhists even went so far as to give that a material quality. They called it avijnapti rupa. An intention that you don't actually physically carry out, that doesn't show itself. You still carry it around, you still got to pay karmic consequences. So karma also means debt. Some Buddhists talked about it as an aviparnasa, which sometimes is translated as something which is permanent or indelible, but it's also taken by some people to mean an IOU. Every action ends up being an IOU that you write to yourself. And the account's going to come due someday. The more good karma, the more good stuff will come to you. The more bad karma, obviously, the more bad stuff that'll come to you. In general, Buddhists talk about karma in what I would call 3 registers, or 3 frameworks. It's a little more complicated, but this sort of works as a handy way of looking at it. And there's some overlap between the 3 of them, but they're distinct enough that we could say there are really different discourses about each of these within Buddhism. One is the simple mechanics of cause and effect. Do a certain action, it leads to a certain effect. It's not really that simple because it's not really linear. It's not really a cause leads to an effect. The more you start to analyze things, like the question, how did you get here, the more you realize at every junction, there are all sorts of different things that were converging. So every cause and effect moment is really many, many causes and many, many effects all happening and influencing themselves. Some Buddhists, the Madhyamikas, for instance, declare there's so much going on. It's so complicated, you can't really analyze it to the fullest extent. So Chandrakirti, important Madhyamikan, called it pratyayata matrina, which basically means utter conditionality. Everything is so conditioned, you can't even really break it down. And when you try to, you start to play mental games with yourself. But most of us, we have to have some sort of explanation. Something simpler that we can get our hands on, get our minds around. So all is suffering, first noble truth. Second noble truth, it has a cause. Actually, samudaya means what has to come together for that thing to arise. What complex of things have to produce that. And if you read enough Buddhist literature, you get at least 2 answers, not just one answer. The more common answer in the textbooks is desire. But the answer, as I mentioned before, actually is ignorance. Problem is, ignorance, like saying everything is utterly conditioned, is hard to get your mind around. If I tell you you're ignorant, that's your problem. Go cure it. What are you going to do? Nothing. Get mad at me for calling you ignorant. If I tell you your problem is desire, well, you can work with that. You can see desire. You can feel desire. You can start to develop your own program for what to do about it. How are you going to develop a program for being ignorant? So it's easy to focus on desire. Eventually, you start to question where all these desires coming from. Well, you start discovering something about your ignorance. Ignorance leads to something called samskaras. That's one that's hard to translate. Sometimes people translate it as karmic formations. I like to call it embodied conditioning. It's conditioning which is already so deeply embedded in you. It's in your body. You don't even think about it. It just comes out. When it comes out, they call that cetana, and it's a volition. Volitions come from where? And where do we keep them? Where does anger come from? We think when we get angry, there's that thing out there that's making us angry. They said something offensive, or that was bothersome, so I'm going to be angry at that. But actually, it's built up from all sorts of things you don't pay any attention to, that are there latently, which is why you got angry about that, and maybe the person sitting next to you didn't. We don't usually look at that. That's the samskaras. Once the anger comes out, then you have the volition to do something about it. I'm going to be angry at that person, I'll yell, I'll do whatever. Then it's visible. There's a very elaborate vocabulary that Buddhists come up with for these samskaras. But they had a lot of theoretical problems. That's where Yogacara partially comes in. They had a lot of theoretical problems explaining samskaras. How does it actually work? The mechanics of it. So that was the first level, mechanics. Second level is probably the level most of you think of first when you hear the word karma, particularly in a Buddhist context, which is kind of the moral causality. Good deeds, bad deeds, reward and punishment, advancing on the spiritual path, backsliding on the spiritual path. And of course, obviously, some scars are that play there too. And that's also where debt comes into play. Some Buddhists will say, for instance, if you wrong somebody, you have to make amends. You have to make some sort of restitution. And if you don't do it in this life, you'll be doing it in the next life. Payback will be there. There is a karmic debt. But conditioning works. In that middle part of Pratityasamutpada, Buddha addresses this. Conditioning works by the same thing that psychologists have talked about, and the Greek philosophers and the medieval philosophers, and everybody seems to know about it, but it's always news to us. Basically, pain and pleasure. Buddhists call that Vedana. Pain and pleasure. Something feels good, you want more of it, and you want to hold on to it. Something feels bad, you want to get rid of it and make it stop. You do it enough, it becomes a habit. Habits are desensitizing. So you go to a new restaurant that opens in your neighborhood. You look, it's an ethnic restaurant of an ethnicity you're not completely familiar with. So you go down the menu looking at all these strange little items with strange names you're not familiar with. And you decide, okay, I'll try this one. This one sounds like it might be okay. So you order it. Some dish you've never eaten before comes out. And lo and behold, it's delicious. It's wonderful. This is one of the best things you've ever eaten in your life. So next week you're back in the restaurant. Now you don't have any dilemma about what to order on the menu. You know exactly what you want. You order the same thing. It's still good, but it's not as amazing as that first time. You're back there next week. You're ordering the same dish. Now it's, tastes the same as long as they didn't change the cook. You're enjoying it, but you're not even really tasting the food. Now you're more busy with the conversation with your friends. A year from then, you're barely tasting the food. That's also karma. Some people are very brave. They'll order different things each time. But there are lots of people. I'm sure if you're not one of them, you know people who are like that. Same thing every time. It's karma. Conditioning. Is that moral? Yeah, it's kind of moral too. Because pain and pleasure can be very powerful moral conditioners. Most of you have heard of things like heaven and hell. What's heaven and hell? Cosmic cookie versus cosmic spanking. And it works, doesn't it? Great motivator. You'll do good things for the cosmic cookie. You'll hopefully avoid doing bad things to not get the cosmic spanking. But just as in real life, spankings don't necessarily always cure bad behavior. It takes more than that as well. And the third level is, or the third framework, register, is karma as the basic fundamental problem. What's Buddhism about? Whatever else it's about curing the problem of karma. Karma is what has you caught here now, and in the next life, and in the past life, and the rounds of birth and death. It's why you suffer. It's all karma. To practice Buddhism is to practice something that will overcome karma. So they all work together. The Vinaya literature turns a lot of this into rules. More of those laundry lists of things, the do's and don'ts. But the Vinaya also, like the other kinds of lists, same kinds of lists actually, often the same lists even, have to be unpacked. And the Vinaya itself, at least certain parts of it, they usually come with a story about how the rule was formulated in the first place. What sort of problem led to Buddha sitting down and deciding, okay, from now on, do this, don't do that. The rules don't just come from the sky, they have a reason. And he famously said, just before his nirvana, keep the major rules, you can dispense with the minor rules, but he wasn't clear about which were which, and they've been fighting about it ever since. So it means not all the rules have to be followed strictly, but which to be followed, which not to be followed. You have to unpack them to know. You have to kind of figure it out for yourself. There are also Jataka stories. Have you ever read Jataka stories? Past lives of the Buddha. If you read the full list of, the full complement of Jataka stories, a lot of them are really sort of bloodthirsty, really cruel, nasty stuff. You know, a lot of that, they wouldn't even make movies. They wouldn't even make R-rated movies. They're really pretty gross. So why are all these Jataka stories? Well, that's also moral persuasion of a certain extent. My personal theory why that particular genre, I have two theories about it. They're both crazy, but I'll share them anyway. One is I think Jataka stories began with Buddha when he had people who got into certain kinds of situations that needed to be straightened out, which if you read enough of the early texts, you know happen all the time. And rather than tell people directly, you know, you're at fault, you make up with so-and-so, he would tell them a story. And of course, everybody can tell from the story, when you hear it in the story and you're not personally involved, who's right and who's wrong, who's doing good stuff, who's doing bad stuff. The moral of the story at the end of the Jataka would be, okay, last time you were so-and-so, you were so-and-so, you were so-and-so. Now you know, it's your fault. You better apologize to so-and-so. I think it's how it started. The genre then picked up. The bloody stuff is, I think, because if we think about what Central Asia, that link between India and China, which was very active early on in the Buddhist world. There are mentions of people coming and meeting the Buddha in his time. A lot of things were already coming from Taxila and so on from north of that. If we look at the way things are there now in that part of the world, which is in the news a lot these days, it's not a very calm place. If you read Xuanzang's travelogues from 1500 years ago, he describes the different regions and the people there, and it sounds like you're reading the newspaper. So I suspect if we go back another 1500 years or whatever, it would have been the same story. And these were stories to actually civilize people who, they didn't quite work, but people who were culturally prone to those kinds of very, very cruel actions. To sort of tell them how to work things out. Kind of karma. Anyway, it's my crazy theory. And speaking of Taxila and Pakistan, that brings us to Yogacara. Vasubandhu and Asanga, the half-brothers who are considered the founders of Yogacara, come from a city at that time was called Purushapura. Nowadays we call it Peshawar. If you're following the newspapers, I probably don't have to say very much more. Peshawar is a place, if you want to go meet a terrorist, that's terrorist central. You won't have to look very far. You might not make it back alive, but you'll find them there. It didn't used to be like that. There was a time when people like Asanga and Vasubandhu grew up there. And both of them eventually leave and come to India. Vasubandhu goes to Kashmir to study Abhidharma with Sarvastivadins, with Kashmiri Sarvastivadins. And Asanga, it's a little bit murkier, but the general theory is that he studied with a school called Mahashasakas, which are similar to Sarvastivadins, a little bit different, but had a similar Abhidharma, but probably paid more attention to Agama. And judging by Agama would be the sutras. Judging by his writings, even when he writes the Abhidharma Samuccaya, text on Abhidharma, he doesn't quote a single Abhidharma text. He quotes a lot of sutras in that. He's always quoting sutras. So he was very, very well steeped in Agamas. Both of them, quite remarkably, set out to make a comprehensive study of all the forms of Buddhism and all the minutiae of all the arguments that all the Buddhists had accumulated since the time of the Buddha, which was many, many centuries earlier. We're talking in the 300s, 4th century, quite a bit later than the Buddha. And trying to evaluate how does this all fit together and what makes sense. The Buddhists had argued about pretty much everything at that point. Big difference between Indian Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism is Indian Buddhists love to argue about everything. Chinese Buddhists like to at least pretend everything is harmony. No argument. Indians don't hide their disagreements. No pretense of harmony. So they had to wade through all this stuff. And Asanga apparently hit on it first. So after going through all the prior Buddhist teachings and schools, he formulated a new kind of Mahayana, which is probably today called the Yogacara school, not because they were practicing yoga, certainly not the kind of yoga class that you would sign up for, but because a text that he's responsible for is called the Yogacara Bhumi. So just as the Madhyamikans are called Madhyamikans because Nagarjuna wrote a text called the Madhyamaka Karika, so they're named after their text, or the Vaibhashikas are called the Vaibhashikas because their main text was a text called the Mahavibhasha. A lot of schools are named after their key text. Sometimes they're named after the person, the founder, sometimes after their text. Yogacara is probably called Yogacara because Yogacara text. What does the name mean in the text? Shenzong interprets it in his translation of the title as kind of the teachings of the masters, the discipline of the masters. So yoga there basically means discipline. Discipline is some sort of activity you engage in a disciplined, systematic way. It's physical, it's mental, it's anything that's disciplined. It's training, something you train at. That's Yogacara. Okay, I'm gonna keep my eye on the time. Abhidharma, which they both studied in its heyday, and that was its heyday, was, and this is sometimes overlooked, particularly when one gets blinded by all the laundry lists that one finds, and Abhidharma is just filled with them. One overlooks the fact that in its heyday, Abhidharma was a debate tradition. The tradition was not about either formulating simply a laundry list or memorizing endless laundry lists that other people had formulated. The idea was about arguing about everything, determining what goes in column A, what goes in column B. And there's a reason for it. There's a lot at stake. It's not just for the heck of it. There's a lot at stake about determining what goes here, what goes there. What does this entail? What does that entail? And that was the battlefield where you hash that out. You debated. Your school got together with the other school and you argued about this stuff. And it meant something. Both of them come out of this tradition. They come out of this debate tradition. They raise the stakes on it. So Venerable Dhammadipa mentioned Dharmakirti and the logic tradition. These are the two guys that invented the Buddhist logic tradition, called Hetu Vidya, the science of reasoning, the reasons and causes of things. To do it in a scientific way, rationally. An important tool. Debate changed after that. It took a few centuries for it to really take hold, but the debate tradition then moved, by the time of Dharmakirti, from Abhidharma debates to Hetu Vidya type debates. Same vigor, but a whole different playing field. One of the things that Dinaga, another important Yogacara figure, added to the mix was a way of having debate not just be amongst the Buddhists, which is what Abhidharmic debates have been. Because to get in an Abhidharma debate, you have to already pretty much accept a lot of categories that if you're not a Buddhist wouldn't make a lot of sense to you right offhand. Dinaga changes the rules of debate and argument through his logic principles, particularly this idea called prasiddha, where both parties have to agree on basic tenets before they can even enter a debate. So that it was suddenly possible for Buddhists to debate with non-Buddhists. And all kinds of groups to debate with each other. What it would mean in simple terms is, for instance, if a Buddhist today wanted to debate with a Christian, things like this do happen. The last thing a Christian could do, according to Dinaga's rules, is start quoting Christian scripture. Buddhists also couldn't start quoting Buddhist scripture. Because a Christian will right away say, that doesn't mean anything. And the Buddhist will say, your scripture doesn't mean anything. You have to find tenets, ideas, concepts that you both agree on. Common ground, before you can even start the debate. And then follow logical principles. For Dinaga, something was Buddhist because it was true. It wasn't true because it was Buddhist. Another way of saying investigate, explore, pay attention. Because somebody tells you something. Up to Dinaga's day, the fact that it was in scripture or that an authority told you this is the truth, that was considered viable, valid knowledge. You had to follow it. It's called apta pramana or shabda pramana. Dinaga said, no, that's not enough. If you're a Buddhist in a Buddhist community, then of course there's apta pramana. And Buddhist scriptures will tell Buddhists what's meaningful. But beyond the Buddhist community, not meaningful. Then you've got to prove it otherwise. If it's true, it'll be true. So explore. It's also an invitation not just to look at quote-unquote Buddhist truths for all the answers, and if something seems to be coming from somewhere else, from an Israeli psychologist 40 years ago, for instance, that suddenly it's not as important. It's all important. Look at it all. Test it, evaluate. Buddha early on said, the Pali, Epasaka, which basically translates as, come check it out. Look for yourself. Explore. You have to believe in order to explore. There's no reason to check it out. If you don't think it could work, if you don't think it might be right. So there's some belief involved. But you have to have a test. You don't believe indefinitely. A philosopher once pointed out the difference between human beings and mice is if you devise a little maze and you put a piece of cheese in part of the maze and you release the mouse and he'll run around. Eventually he'll find the piece of cheese. If you then put the piece of cheese somewhere else in the maze and release the mouse, he'll go back to the first place, he won't find it, and he'll start looking, and eventually he'll find the piece of cheese again. If you do the same experiment with the human being, he'll go back to the same place and wait for the cheese to come back. That's also karma. Okay, it's probably a good place to take a break. Look for the cheese. Yeah, we'll take a break. 10 minutes break.